In 39 CE, the Roman Senate received an invitation to dinner from a horse. The horse had its own house, its own servants, its own furniture made of ivory and marble, and the Emperor of Rome was about to make it their colleague. Now, you've probably heard this story before, Caligula, the mad emperor, loved his horse so much he made it a consul. It's one of those historical facts that gets passed around at dinner parties. But here's what nobody talks about. Caligula wasn't insane when he did this. He knew exactly what he was doing, and when you understand why he did it, you'll realise this wasn't the act of a madman, it was an act of war. A calculated, devastating insult aimed directly at the most powerful men in Rome. The horse was a weapon, and the Senate was the target. The horse's name was Incitatus, Latin for swift, or at full gallop. And according to the ancient historian Suetonius, this animal lived better than most Roman citizens. Incitatus slept in a stable made of marble. He ate oats mixed with gold flakes from an ivory manger. He wore a collar studded with precious gems and slept under purple blankets, purple being the colour reserved for emperors. 18 servants attended to his every need. The night before chariot races, Caligula would send soldiers through the surrounding neighbourhoods with a single order: absolute silence. Anyone who disturbed Incitatus' sleep would answer to the emperor personally, and then came the announcement that would echo through 2,000 years of history. Caligula planned to make this horse a consul of Rome. But to understand why that was so devastating, you need to understand who Caligula was before he became a monster. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, was born on August 31st, 12 CE, into the most powerful family in the world. His father, Germanicus, was Rome's most beloved general, a man so popular that when he walked through the streets, crowds would weep with joy just to see him. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself. Little Gaius grew up in military camps following his father on campaign. The soldiers adored him. They gave him a miniature uniform complete with tiny military boots. Those boots were called caligae, and so the soldiers nicknamed the boy Caligula, Little Boot. He would grow to hate that name. When Caligula was 7 years old, his father died under mysterious circumstances in Syria. His mother was convinced it was poison, that the Emperor Tiberius had ordered her husband's murder. She said so publicly, loudly, repeatedly. Tiberius did not take this well. Over the next 6 years, Caligula watched his family systematically destroyed. His mother was arrested, exiled, and starved to death in prison. His 2 older brothers were declared enemies of the state. One was executed, the other driven to suicide. His aunts, cousins, and extended family were picked off one by one. By the time Caligula was 19, he was essentially alone, the last surviving male of his line, and that's when Tiberius summoned him to Capri. Now, Capri sounds pleasant, a beautiful island in the Bay of Naples. Today, it's a tourist destination, but in 31 CE, it was something else entirely. Tiberius had retreated there 6 years earlier and refused to return to Rome. He ran the empire from this island fortress, surrounded by informants, torturers, and executioners. Ancient sources describe it as a place of constant fear, where anyone could be accused of treason and killed without trial. This is where 19-year-old Caligula was sent to live. For the next 6 years, he existed in a state of perpetual terror. His host had murdered his entire family. Every word he spoke could be reported, every facial expression analysed for signs of disloyalty. According to Suetonius, Caligula learned to hide his emotions perfectly. He became a master of performance, showing only what Tiberius wanted to see, feeling nothing that might betray him. When informants tried to provoke him into criticising Tiberius, he refused to take the bait. As one ancient writer put it, never was there a better slave or a worse master. But Suetonius also notes something darker. Even during these years of carefully controlled obedience, Caligula couldn't entirely suppress what he called his natural cruelty and viciousness. He was permitted to attend torture sessions and executions on Capri. He didn't look away, he watched. On March 16th, 37 CE, Tiberius finally died. He was 77 years old and had ruled for 23 years. Rome celebrated his death more than they had celebrated anything in decades. And then something unexpected happened. The 24-year-old survivor of Capri, the orphan whose entire family had been destroyed, the young man who had spent 6 years learning to show no emotion, he became emperor. and Rome loved him. The first 7 months of Caligula's reign were described by the Jewish diplomat Philo as a golden age. Over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in thanksgiving for his ascension. He doubled bonuses for the Praetorian Guard. He gave 150 sesterces to every Roman citizen. He recalled exiles. He burned the documents from Tiberius's treason trials, publicly promising that no one would be prosecuted based on the old emperor's paranoid investigations. After decades of fear under Tiberius, Rome finally had a young, generous, popular ruler. The nightmare was over, for exactly 7 months. In October of 37 CE, something happened to Caligula. Ancient sources describe a sudden, severe illness, a fever with delirium that lasted approximately 30 days. Rome's citizens poured into the streets praying for his recovery. Some even offered their own lives in exchange for his survival, posting public placards promising to die if the gods would spare their emperor. By late October, Caligula recovered, but he was not the same man. The generous, clement ruler who had burned treason documents now began new investigations. The emperor who had honoured his family now forced his own father-in-law to cut his throat with a razor. The young man who had survived 6 years by controlling his emotions now seemed to have lost control entirely. Within months, he would force his cousin Tiberius Gemellus, his co-heir, to commit suicide. The charge? Gemellus had breath that smelled like medicine. Caligula interpreted this as evidence he was taking antidotes against poison. When confronted about this suspicion, Caligula reportedly responded, "What? An antidote against Caesar?" The implication was clear. If Gemellus feared being poisoned, he must be guilty of something, and if he wasn't guilty, he had no reason to fear. Therefore, the antidote itself was proof of treason. This was the logic that would define the next 3 years. Modern historians and medical researchers have proposed several explanations for what happened during those 30 days. Some suggest temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition known to cause aggression, religious delusions, hypersexuality, and dramatic personality changes. Others point to lead poisoning, since Roman elites consumed enormous quantities of wine sweetened with lead acetate. High lead levels cause paranoia, impulsivity, and cognitive decline. The most compelling theory is encephalitis, inflammation of the brain from infection. This would explain the sudden onset of fever, the delirium, and the permanent personality changes that followed recovery. The truth is, we'll never know. What we do know is that Caligula went into that illness as one person and emerged as someone else entirely. And this new Caligula had very specific ideas about the Roman Senate. To understand what Caligula did next, you need to understand how the Roman Senate worked. By 37 CE, the Senate had been reduced from the governing body of a republic to something closer to an advisory council. They still held theoretical power. They confirmed emperors, passed laws, administered provinces. But everyone knew the real power lay with whoever commanded the legions. The Senate's primary remaining function was legitimacy. They provided the veneer of constitutional government. They were the institution that made dictatorship look like democracy, and they were acutely aware of their own irrelevance. This created a particular kind of senator, men who had inherited vast wealth and ancient names, who held titles that had once meant absolute power, who now spent their days voting as they were told and pretending they had a choice. They were proud, sensitive about their dignity, and utterly dependent on imperial favour for their survival. Caligula saw this, and he found it contemptible. His attack started small, subtle humiliations designed to remind senators of their true position. He made over 30 senators run beside his chariot in their togas for miles. These were old men, respected men whose ancestors had conquered the Mediterranean. Now they were jogging alongside a vehicle, sweating through their formal robes while the emperor watched from above. At dinner parties, he made senators wait on him personally. They stood at the head or foot of his couch with napkins ready to serve, transformed from Rome's ruling class into imperial servants. When the consuls forgot to proclaim his birthday as a holiday, Caligula didn't just reprimand them, he deposed them entirely. For 3 days, Rome had no consuls at all. The highest office in the theoretical republic simply didn't exist because the emperor was annoyed. But these were just the appetizers. As the months progressed, the humiliations grew darker. Caligula began holding what might be called truth ceremonies. Senators would be summoned before him and forced to confess, not to crimes they had committed, but to desires that contradicted their identities. A senator known for his morality might be forced to admit to perversions. A senator proud of his courage might be made to acknowledge his cowardice. The confessions were public. The shame was permanent. The philosopher Seneca, who lived through this period, later wrote that under Caligula, men were punished not just for what they said, but for what they felt, and for what they didn't feel strongly enough. If you didn't laugh at the emperor's jokes with sufficient enthusiasm, that was noted. If you seemed sad when you should be happy, that was suspicious. The emotional performance that had kept young Caligula alive on Capri was now required of everyone, all the time, and it was never enough. After his recovery from illness, Caligula began claiming something that Roman emperors had carefully avoided. He was a god. Previous emperors had been declared divine after death, a political honour that acknowledged their importance, without requiring worship of a living person. Augustus had allowed temples to be built to his genius, his guiding spirit, but not to himself directly. Tiberius had rejected divine honours entirely. Caligula demanded them. He built a temple dedicated specifically to his own godhead. Inside stood a life-sized golden statue of himself, which was redressed every day in whatever clothes the emperor happened to be wearing. If Caligula wore purple, the statue wore purple. If he put on military armour, so did his golden twin. He appointed priests to this temple. He established sacrifices. The offerings were appropriately expensive: flamingos, peacocks, pheasants, guinea hens from Numidia. Only the rarest, most costly birds would suffice for the divine emperor. But he didn't stop there. Caligula ordered the heads removed from famous statues of Roman gods, including Jupiter, king of the gods, and replaced with his own likeness. He positioned himself in the temple of Castor and Pollux, standing between the divine twins as if he belonged among them. He built a bridge connecting his palace directly to the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, symbolically joining his residence to the home of the gods. At night, according to Suetonius, Caligula would invite the full and radiant moon to his embraces and bed. During the day, he held whispered conversations with Jupiter Capitolinus, the greatest god in the Roman pantheon, sometimes making threats: "Lift me up or I'll lift thee," and the Senate. The Senate watched. They watched their statues desecrated. They watched their temples transformed. They watched an emperor claim equality with Jupiter himself. And they did nothing. What could they do? Caligula commanded the Praetorian Guard. Caligula controlled the legions. Caligula decided who lived and who died. Their only options were compliance or death. So they complied. They voted to establish the imperial cult. They approved the temples. They offered sacrifices to their living emperor god. And with every act of submission, they became more humiliatingly powerless. Caligula watched their compliance, and he found it contemptible. If the Senate would vote for anything, absolutely anything, what did that say about them? What did that say about the institution they represented? They were supposed to be the guardians of the Republic. They were supposed to be the best men in Rome. And here they were, burning incense to a 25-year-old who claimed to chat with the moon. So Caligula decided to test exactly how far their submission would go. Enter Incitatus. Incitatus was a racehorse, and in Rome, chariot racing wasn't just a sport. It was a religion. The circus factions, blues, greens, whites, reds, commanded loyalties that modern sports fans would recognise. Riots broke out over race results. Emperors openly favoured their teams. Successful charioteers became celebrities whose names have survived 2,000 years. Caligula was obsessed with the greens. He spent hours at the stables, eating and sleeping among the horses. He drove chariots himself, sometimes with Incitatus, his fastest, most prized racehorse. But what started as enthusiasm became something else. According to Suetonius, Caligula built Incitatus a stable of marble with an ivory manger, gave him purple blankets and a collar studded with gems, assigned 18 servants to care for him personally, fed him oats mixed with gold flakes, invited him to dinner where the horse was served golden barley, silenced entire neighbourhoods before races so Incitatus could sleep undisturbed, drank toast to the horse's health and fortune. Then came the announcement: Caligula intended to make Incitatus a consul. Suetonius is careful here, noting only that it is even said Caligula planned this, suggesting the historian himself wasn't entirely certain. But the story was believed, it was repeated. It became the defining image of Caligula's reign. Modern historians have debated what the Incitatus story actually means. Some argue it was an elaborate joke. Caligula's way of mocking the Senate's irrelevance. If a horse could be consul, what did that say about the humans currently holding the office? They did nothing important. They decided nothing important. They were ceremonial props in an autocratic system, and everyone knew it. By proposing Incitatus, Caligula was forcing the Senate to confront their own powerlessness. They couldn't refuse. He was the emperor. But they couldn't accept without admitting that their ancient institution had become so meaningless that a horse could serve in it. It was a trap, and like all of Caligula's traps, it had no good exit. Others suggest genuine mental illness. Perhaps Caligula truly believed Incitatus deserved the honour. Perhaps the brain damage from his illness had erased whatever distinction he once made between appropriate and absurd. The truth is probably somewhere between these explanations. Caligula likely knew exactly how outrageous the proposal was, and that was precisely the point. The joke and the cruelty were inseparable. Humiliating the Senate was both entertaining and politically useful. And if some senators actually had to attend a dinner party hosted by a horse, forced to make polite conversation with their equine colleague while the emperor watched and laughed, so much the better. The Incitatus affair wasn't Caligula's only spectacular display of contempt for convention. In 39 or 40 CE, he ordered the construction of something that seemed to serve no purpose at all, a floating bridge across the Bay of Naples. The bridge stretched approximately 3.6 kilometres, about 2.2 miles, from Baiae to Puteoli. Building it required commandeering merchant ships from across the empire, anchoring them in a double line, heaping earth upon them and paving the entire structure like the famous Appian Way. It took months to complete. It disrupted trade throughout the Mediterranean. Those merchant ships were supposed to be carrying grain. It cost enormous sums from a treasury that was already under strain. And when it was finished, Caligula used it for exactly 2 days. On the first day, he rode across on a white horse, wearing a crown of oak leaves, the highest military honour, a gold-embroidered cloak, a golden buckler and sword, the breastplate of Alexander the Great himself, which had been stolen from his tomb in Alexandria. On the second day, he drove across in a chariot, accompanied by the entire Praetorian Guard. Then he abandoned the bridge, the ships were released, the structure was dismantled, the whole massive project had served no practical purpose whatsoever. Why build it at all? The ancient sources offer a fascinating explanation. Years earlier, an astrologer had told Tiberius that Caligula would never become emperor. The exact quote reportedly was, "Gaius has no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding across the Bay of Baiae on horseback." So Caligula built a bridge and rode across on horseback. The prophecy had said it was impossible. Caligula made it possible. He bent the physical world to prove an astrologer wrong, or perhaps to prove that for a Roman emperor there was no such thing as impossible. Some historians suggest the bridge was also meant to intimidate foreign powers. By demonstrating Rome's ability to build military infrastructure on this scale, Caligula was sending a message to Germany and Britain about what their legions might face if they resisted. But most scholars believe the simplest explanation. Caligula did it because he could, because no one could stop him, because the absurdity was the point. He wanted Rome to see that an emperor could spend millions building a bridge to nowhere, ride across it twice, and tear it down. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. That was the message. That was always the message. The bizarre spectacles, the horse consul, the floating bridge, the conversations with Jupiter, these are the stories that have survived 2,000 years. They're memorable because they're strange. But they weren't the worst of what Caligula did. The ancient sources describe systematic cruelty that went far beyond eccentricity. Caligula developed what Suetonius calls a signature execution order. Strike so that he may feel that he is dying. This meant no quick deaths. Instead, executioners were instructed to make multiple shallow cuts, prolonging suffering as long as possible. The goal wasn't just death, it was the experience of dying. Other documented torture methods included branding nobles with hot irons before other punishments, sawing bodies apart while victims were still alive, caging men of high rank on all fours like animals, removing tongues from prisoners who protested their innocence, then returning them to the arena to be killed by wild beasts, burning a writer alive for composing a line that could be interpreted as mocking the emperor. When gladiatorial games required live animals to feed on condemned prisoners, Caligula couldn't afford cattle, so he reviewed the prison population personally. According to Suetonius, He walked through a colonnade where prisoners were assembled and simply pointed, "From bald head to bald head," executing every man whose head was visible between two bald prisoners. The selection was random. The victims had no idea why they were chosen. That randomness was part of the terror. Caligula had a favourite saying. It came from a Greek tragedy. "Let them hate me, so they but fear me." This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a governing philosophy. Caligula seemed to believe that fear, absolute paralysing fear, was more useful than love or loyalty. Love could fade, loyalty could waver, but fear was reliable, and so he cultivated it. He would kiss senators on the neck during friendly conversations, then whisper, "Off comes this beautiful head whenever I give the word." He complained that his reign lacked great disasters, a plague, a famine, a military defeat, something to be remembered by. When his grandmother Antonia tried to offer advice, he cut her off. "Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody." This was the philosophy of unlimited power, stripped of all pretense. There was no higher authority, there was no accountability, there was only Caesar's will. Caligula's extravagances came at a cost. Ancient sources claim he spent 2.7 billion sesterces in his first year alone, an almost incomprehensible sum that modern scholars debate was even possible. What's certain is that by 39 CE, the imperial treasury was under strain. Caligula's response was to implement the most aggressive taxation system Rome had ever seen. He taxed prostitution, 1 embrace per transaction, collected personally rather than through traditional tax farmers. He taxed marriage. He taxed lawsuits, 1/40th of the disputed sum with penalties for anyone who dropped their case. He taxed taverns. He taxed craftsmen. He taxed porters, 12.5% of their daily wages. Most infamously, he may have established what ancient sources call a urine tax, vectigal urinae, presumably on the urine collected from public toilets and used in industrial processes like tanning and cloth production. And for the wealthy, there were gifts. Imperial agents would visit senators and equestrians with a simple message. The emperor expects a demonstration of your friendship and loyalty. The expected gift was substantial. Refusal was unthinkable. And for those who couldn't afford the gift, high-interest loans were conveniently available, ensuring permanent debt and dependency. Caligula kept meticulous records of who paid, how much, and who still owed. This information was leverage. This information was power. The most scandalous financial scheme involved the palace itself. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caligula transformed part of the imperial palace into what they describe as a brothel. Luxurious rooms were prepared, matrons and young people of noble birth were stationed there, imperial pages were sent through the forums and public halls, inviting men of all ages to participate. Those who came were offered loans at high interest rates. Clerks publicly recorded the names of contributors to Caesar's revenues. Modern scholars debate what this actually means. Some believe it was a literal brothel, the emperor pimping out Rome's nobility for profit. Others argue it's a metaphor for financial exploitation. Senators forced to pay exorbitant rent for palace rooms where they were held as virtual hostages. Either way, the underlying reality is clear. Caligula used financial coercion as a control mechanism. The nobility was forced to pay for proximity to power, while their dignity was systematically destroyed. By January of 41 CE, Caligula had been emperor for just under 4 years. In that time, he had forced over 30 senators to commit suicide or face execution, publicly humiliated Rome's most powerful families, claimed divine status and demanded worship, built bridges and monuments to his own ego, implemented crushing taxation, turned the palace into an instrument of exploitation, made torture and execution into entertainment. The Senate despised him. The Praetorian Guard, exhausted by increasingly bizarre and violent orders, had begun to waver. Even his own court lived in constant fear. The breaking point came from an unexpected source, a Praetorian tribune named Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea was an older soldier, a veteran of many campaigns, respected by his men, and Caligula had made him a personal target. The emperor discovered that Chaerea had a somewhat effeminate voice. This became a source of endless mockery. When Chaerea asked for the daily military password, Caligula would give him obscene terms like Priapus, the god of fertility depicted with an enormous phallus, or Venus, the goddess of love, implying Chaerea was womanly, day after day, in front of his soldiers, for months. It seems like a small thing. But in the honour-obsessed culture of the Roman military, it was devastating. Chaerea's authority was undermined every time he had to repeat these passwords to his men. And so, in January 41 CE, Chaerea began organising a conspiracy. The conspirators included praetorian officers, senators, and members of the palace staff. They chose their moment carefully. On January 24th, 41 CE, Caligula was attending theatrical performances in a temporary theatre near the palace. During a break around midday, he left through a narrow covered passage, a corridor where crowds couldn't gather and bodyguards couldn't form a proper protective formation. Chaerea was waiting. The accounts vary slightly, but they agree on the essential facts. Chaerea struck first, cutting Caligula across the neck or jaw. Other conspirators rushed in. The emperor fell. He was stabbed 31 times. Some sources say he died almost instantly. Others claim he tried to crawl away, calling out that he was still alive. Either way, the end was quick compared to the prolonged deaths he had inflicted on so many others. Caligula was 29 years old. He had ruled for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. The Senate immediately voted damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Caligula's name was to be erased from inscriptions, his statues destroyed, his acts officially forgotten. But erasure is harder than it sounds. His coins continued circulating. Removing them would have been economically impossible. His aqueducts, the Aqua Claudia and Annio Novus, still standing in Rome today, couldn't be torn down, and the written accounts, composed decades later by historians like Suetonius and Dio, ensured that his story would be remembered. More ironic still, the man the Praetorians chose as his successor was Claudius, Caligula's uncle, the stammering, limping man whom Caligula had kept alive specifically as a laughingstock, someone so pathetic he posed no threat. Claudius turned out to be one of Rome's most competent emperors. The joke, it seems, was on Caligula after all, and Incitatus, the horse who was going to be consul. Ancient sources don't tell us what happened to him. Presumably he was just a horse, valuable, well-bred, but ultimately an animal. Without an emperor to champion him, the marble stable was likely reassigned, the golden oats discontinued. The Senate survived. The institution that Caligula had mocked, humiliated, and threatened to replace with livestock continued for another 500 years. But the question Caligula asked, the question that made Incitatus so devastating, never really went away. What is the difference between a senator who does nothing important and a horse? What is the purpose of an institution that exists only to rubber-stamp decisions made by someone else? What happens when the people in power are so terrified that they'll vote for anything? Those aren't ancient questions. Those are questions that every generation has to answer for itself. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years, but the trap he set for the Senate, the trap that had no good exit, that's still waiting. The man who killed Caligula, Cassius Chaerea, thought he was restoring the Republic. He was executed within weeks, on the orders of Emperor Claudius, but that's a story for another time.